This is the short video lecture series regarding biodiversity and evolution. On the screen in front of you is a list of key terms associated with this chapter. The items in blue are ones to draw your attention to, including biodiversity, ecological niche, endemic species, generalist species, genetic engineering, geographic isolation, habitat, indicator species, keystone species, native species, niche, non-native species, specialist species, and species diversity. I will focus on some of these terms as we proceed with the slides. Let's look at a case study regarding the decreasing population of amphibians. First of all, amphibians include frogs, toads, and salamanders. There are more than 6,700 different species of frogs, toads, and salamanders. Many populations have declined or vanished. The YouTube link on your screen was the YouTube video that was embedded into the D2L content, which you should have already watched. If you didn't, please make sure you go back and watch the video entitled Endangered Amphibians. It's a brief, short 5-minute video. Over 32% of amphibians are listed as globally endangered. By comparison, just 12% of all bird species and 23% of all mammal species are considered threatened. Hence, there are more issues with population decline with amphibians than there are with birds and mammals. Almost half of all known amphibian species are declining, and it's estimated that 165 amphibian species may already be extinct. So, a greater proportion of amphibians are at imminent risk of extinction more than any other animal class. So, next time you look at a frog in your garden, consider that its ancient ancestors explored the land 140 million years before the dinosaurs. All amphibians have a backbone and are known as vertebrates. They're also considered endothermic, or cold-blooded, and they need sunlight to remain active because they are unable to regulate their own body temperatures. Amphibians breathe through their skin, which is how disease, especially one called chytridiomycosis, led to suffocating infected amphibians. So the fact that they breathe through the skin actually puts them more at risk of sickness as well as exposure to pollutants in the waterways. It's well known, and I'm sure you know this, that as amphibians develop, they go through metamorphosis. They hatch from their eggs, and then they become tadpoles, and they develop legs over time. This whole metamorphosis process is one in which puts them at risk and contributes to their population decline because they can be exposed to different stressors in their environment as well as pollutants throughout that life cycle. So let's look at why amphibians are vanishing and why this should be a concern for us. On the screen in front of you are a few pictures of some of the most endangered amphibians. Let's start with the right side of this screen with Archie's frog. Archie's frog is found only in New Zealand. It is almost indistinguishable from the fossilized remains of frogs that lived over 150 million years ago, leading to its description of a living fossil. This is one of the world's most primitive frogs. It has bizarre features such as tail-wagging muscles, despite having no tail to wag, and it has no eardrums. They cannot croak like most other species of frog, but instead they let out a thin, high-pitched squeak because their eardrums and vocal sacs have never developed in this group of frogs. It therefore does not communicate by sound, but is instead thought to use scent. The male guards the eggs in moist nests, and tailed froglets that hatch out crawl onto the father's back, where they remain for several weeks while they develop. It is primarily threatened by fungal disease, the chytridiomycosis, as well as introduced predators such as rats and mice. The Archie's frog has suffered a population decline of about 88% and has a population density of about 0.28 frogs per square meter in New Zealand. So this is definitely an amphibian species and population that has declined drastically and is in definite need of protection, and hence has been labeled an endangered amphibian species. Okay, let's take a look at the Chinese giant salamander pictured in the top right corner of your screen. The Chinese giant salamander has become extremely rare as a result of habitat destruction and overexploitation. It's considered the largest living species of amphibian, and it reaches a maximum length of about 1.8 meters or 4.5 feet. It likes to live in cool, fast-flowing streams and mountain lakes, and predominantly feeds on fish and crustaceans. The breeding season for the Chinese giant salamander occurs between August and September, when 500 eggs are laid in a burrow and then guarded by the male. Again, this species is threatened by overharvesting for the food trade, as well as the destruction and degradation of its habitat. They are considered to be both a luxury food item and an important source of traditional medicines in China. So now it's listed as critically endangered because it has undergone a massive population decline over the past 30 years. A factor that renders the Chinese giant salamander particularly vulnerable to hunting is that they're very easy to catch. They hide in rock crevices and may be easily found and hooked right out of their hiding place. They remain a lucrative option for hunters who can sell the flesh for around $100 per kilogram or $30 per pound, which is a high price per pound. Although there is a commercial farming and breeding of these species, the vast majority of Chinese giant salamanders being traded are believed to originate from the wild, and their harvesting is neither regulated nor managed. In addition, although captured Chinese giant salamanders breed well in captivity, there has been no success so far in breeding second generations, and so the captive population is currently unsustainable and requires the capture of more animals from the wild. So this is definitely a species that needs to be protected, and limits put on harvesting of these species from the wild. This map shows the global diversity of amphibian species throughout the world. Notice that the dark blue colors indicate a few amphibian species living in those regions like northern Canada, Alaska, Russia. That's probably attributed to the tundra climate and that it's just too cold for the amphibians to live in that region. Here in northern Africa, we have some desert regions, so it may be that there's lack of water available for the amphibians. And the darker colors of oranges and reds indicate a good species biodiversity for amphibians, ranging up to 138 different species. So obviously the Amazon rainforest in Brazil is going to have that red color to it due to the variety that's present there. And there's a few locations along the western coastline of Africa, along the coastline of Australia, as well as along our southern coastline in the United States. So causes of decline in regards to amphibians are listed on the screen in front of you. Habitat loss is a major cause of the decline. The amphibians' normal habitat includes a semi-aquatic environment, and they begin life in a pond or stream, and then they move on to land as adults. So human activities such as building and construction have driven out amphibian populations. Invasive species such as the bullfrog or the cane toad also reduce the amphibian population by consuming them or spreading diseases. Parasites can also cause damage to amphibians through deformity and premature death. As an indicator species, amphibians are very susceptible to changes in the climate. Global warming is greatly reducing frog populations because they need moisture to survive. So without that moisture, the frog eggs won't make it. They're soft and delicate to begin with, and in dry climates it prevents frogs from reproducing. By the way, here's an egg mass just depicting how much moisture is needed. Many frogs are forced to migrate to tops of mountains to their cool, moist climate, which causes overcrowding in dispersed areas. Overconsumption by humans. People do eat frogs or frog legs, and it's prevalent in Europe, Canada, and the US. Frogs are hunted for delicacies such as frog legs and are imported by the millions. I'd like to jump back to parasites and diseases. There's a type of flatworm that's largely to blame for the increase in amphibians that are deformed And there's a picture of a deformed frog here. Also, pollution can contribute to deformities. Eutrophication is causing an impact that leads to increase in amphibian infections. And then, since amphibians are ectotherms, they are vastly affected by changes in the environment, such as temperature and precipitation, as I mentioned earlier. And since they're permeable and they don't have shells on their eggs, it makes them more susceptible to absorb substances from the environments. A major disease that's been attacking the amphibian population is chytridiomycosis. Some of the symptoms that result from this is discolored skin, excessive shedding of skin, nocturnal species becoming active during the day, and eventually cardiac arrest. So this is a diagram of the chytrid life cycle, where it burrows into the skin of the amphibian and it matures, and basically it releases spores, and within 120 days the species will die. So this is a bacteria that's known to be carried by bullfrogs. However, the bacteria likes to make its home in moist soil and water. So as the fungus reproduces, the spores move throughout the water and it attaches to the host or the amphibians. And this is the most common host is the amphibians. Amphibians are very susceptible to this bacteria for two major factors. The first is that they reproduce in the aquatic environment, and it puts them at risk for infection. And secondly, because their skin is so permeable, it puts them at risk for infection as well. So I mentioned invasive species earlier. Scientific reports have suggested that the bullfrogs have caused the leopard frog population to decline over the past 40 years. Lands that were devoid of bullfrogs, such as the wetlands in northern Colorado, contain vast amounts of leopard frogs. So there's definitely a correlation to lack of leopard frogs when there's bullfrogs being present. Originally, bullfrogs were transported around the world for human consumption, and they now run rampant after being established in about 15 different countries. They basically outcompete other amphibians and they consume other amphibians. So that causes a population decline. And as mentioned earlier, the bullfrog carries the bacteria that's associated with the chytridiomycosis that's attacking many amphibians. The cane toad is pictured here, and the cane toad is known as the master of invasion. It thrives in many different countries, and they were actually released in Australia to fight the cane beetles that were eating sugarcane. However, cane toads were nocturnal, whereas the beetles were active during the day, so that approach did not work. The cane toads can reproduce rapidly, and toxins in their glands make them virtually invincible. So they outcompete other amphibians for food, and the map above shows their locations throughout Australia where they are widespread. They actually originate in South America and were later brought to Australia. This map depicts color coding in two ways. The countries are color coded based on unprotected species per area. So the darker colors are depicting a higher number of unprotected species than the lighter colors. And then the pie charts are color coded as well to reflect species that are protected on the different United Nations lists. And then this dark maroon color in these pie charts, or red color, indicates unprotected species on these lists. So it gives you a broad understanding of where countries are doing a good job at protecting amphibian species and which countries need to improve their amphibian species protection. You know, looking at the Amazon being one of the most biodiverse amphibian locations, it looks like they're in this category for unprotected species, and then it does appear out of all these countries that are being looked at, they're at about 64% of species being protected and 10% of being protected, with only 26% being unprotected. And remember, they have over 138 species of amphibians in that region. So the solutions to protect the species are listed here, and we're going to discuss more about biodiversity in the next lecture.